Hey folks, welcome back to Only the Best Fantasy Novels. My name is Robin, and today I'm going to rant about one of my most anticipated releases of this year that absolutely knocked it out of the park, and that is A Tide of Black Steel by Anthony Ryan. So this is the first of an all-new trilogy, The Age of Wrath, I think, or something like that, that's set in the same world as his Covenant of Steel trilogy. This book actually takes place a few decades after the end of that trilogy, and there is some some ties, should we say? Yeah, there's some ties between from that come over from that series that you don't necessarily need to know to read this book, but it does play a pretty significant part of the story, and it would obviously increase your enjoyment, especially when those some of the characters who may or may not have survived from the original trilogy get mentioned. But yeah, so what is A Tide of Black Steel about? So A Tide of Black Steel takes us to the outer islands and the Fjord Islands, and generally just the people of Ascaria, and introduces us to their life. They've led relatively peaceful lives following the over the last couple of decades, and all under the wise rule of the sister queens, who are non-hereditary leaders of this society. Three queens who each have a domain that they're responsible for, essentially. Basically, people just have a chance to live, love, hope, and thrive. And all of that changes when a cult that is essentially the the dark version of their pantheons, that worships the dark version of their pantheon, starts to resurface and starts to operate again. And as if that isn't bad enough, there are mysterious ships sailing and ravaging the outer islands, leaving no survivors, ships with red sails. So, war is clearly on the horizon, and after so many years of peace, the Asgardians may not be ready for what's coming. So, right off the bat, Anthony Ryan absolutely hit it out of the park with this one. I won't lie, as much as this was one of my anticipated releases of the year, I was hesitant to read it when I found out that it was actually based on like Norse. It was Norse inspired, because honestly, it's a setting that really works for me now. Because one of my personal pet peeves with it is that I feel like authors, they when they set something there, or they use it as an inspiration, they tend to treat it as if they should apply little to no creativity to it, just to carry across a sense of authenticity. And there's so many great Norse inspired books that are so creative, so interesting, that prove that you can use a setting, put a creative twist on it, put an interesting twist on it, and make it fresh and invigorating. And that is exactly what Anthony Ryan does here. We have seemingly at first glance, it seems like a relatively basic society, right? But as we learn more and more, as the story unfolds and we get to know these people, they have they have a much more complex society than initially anticipated. It is very much structured in the way that you would think, in the way that you would know traditional Viking society is structured, but ultimately they all answer to a sort of central government ruled by the three queens, and they're non-hereditary. People can work their way up and become one of these queens over time, and they have traveling essentially ambassadors of this central government, who go out among the islands and arbitrate as necessary in these kind of things. In addition to that, they have a culture that is it naturally it sort of mirrors the Norse pantheon in its own refracted way, you can say. And that actually plays a big part in this series, because when we get to find out more about the main antagonists who are ravaging these islands, that particular the twist of who they are and what they're doing here, it's just a really brilliant twist. And it's something that we see commonly over the course of Anthony Ryan's books, where he has a way of using culture and religion to create conflict, and that comes into play here in a really great way, to once again prove that you can be very creative in something that is Norse inspired. You don't just need to be all berserk or blah blah blah. Anyway, rant over. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the setting. It's good. Well, it's well done. It's definitely one of the more interesting ones out there. But the setting isn't all there is to know about the story. The story actually follows four main POVs. The first one that we have is Rulin, who is essentially a village boy. His village got attacked by these invaders. The entire village got wiped out, and due to something that happened whilst he was there, he's essentially captured and taken as a slave back to the homeland of these invaders. And there, his quest is all about fighting to regain his freedom and all of that. The two other POVs that we have that are sort of intertwined are one of Thera and Felnir, who are a brother and sister. So Thera is a Velnir of justice. So you can think of her as like a traveling magistrate. She sails among the islands, arbitrates, essentially enforces the rule of the sister queens, and that sort of thing. So she as she travels among the islands, she begins to find out about this force that's ravaging, and she eventually becomes embroiled in their resistance against them. And then we have Felnir, who is essentially a disgraced warrior due to something that happened when he was a child, and he's pretty much on a quest to kind of regain his to kind of redeem himself in a society where repetition is tied to your martial prowess. And he, as a result of that, he works closely with his grandfather, who is a highly placed official in the central government, essentially, and he becomes embroiled in a quest to go after the vaults of the Adver, which is think of it as like a mythical location from their past. And aiding him on this quest is the fourth POV that we have, which is Elvine. And she is essentially this scholar who is she's a young scholar who's been well trained by her mother, and she, through a series of unfortunate events, she eventually becomes roped into becoming one of the sister queen's proteges, and she's assigned to go on this quest when they gain new information. So she and Felnir eventually get dispatched. And as much as you would think that these four stories they're largely separate and whatever, Anthony Ryan had a really creative way of kind of intertwining them and having different stories having different POVs and different subplots impact each other in really creative and interesting ways. Like these are all characters that are well fleshed out, especially the older ones. They have a lot of history behind them, not necessarily good history, and you see it, you feel it as they come into contact, and they, in not necessarily great ways. So like the characterization was well done, as is typically the case with him. Obviously, like I said, the story it was handled in creative ways, because you have these different subplots and they all interweave and go through and thread their way throughout the story. And in addition to that, we have at least two larger overarching plots going on, because we have the invasion going on, we have the mystery of this mythological site that they're on a quest to discover, and then in addition to that, we have a little bit more mystery that's a lot more slow burn, but which is clearly going to be something that is going to impact the trilogy as a whole. So there's that. And like I mentioned pretty much right at the start, in terms of like world building and so, it's Norse inspired, and Anthony Ryan did a brilliant job of just doing something creative with a setting that honestly is pretty overdone and tired in fantasy. So he absolutely smashed it out of the park. All the reservations I had about this being Norse inspired completely and utterly wiped out. I loved it. Honestly, if you're a fan of the Covenant trilogy, this is definitely a book to pick up. If you're not a fan of the Covenant trilogy, you can still read it. There are going to be some parts here and there that you can obviously fill in from context, but you won't quite get as great an appreciation for as if you read that initial trilogy. In addition to that, this book does have spoilers for what happens with some of the characters at the end of that trilogy. So you can't read this without getting spoiled for that, because a lot of that history, it's fairly recent history, and it does have an impact on some of the things that are still happening. So it's still, don't read this if you're interested in reading that trilogy. You have to read that trilogy first, or else, if you don't mind the spoilers, you can dive straight into this one. But a really great adventure. It's exactly the type of epic fantasy we've come to love from Anthony Ryan. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about The Tide of Black Steel. The title of the second book was already announced. It was actually at the end of the book. I can't remember it right now, but it sounds even more epic. So I just finished this and I'm already hyped for that one. And yeah, that's all I have to say about The Tide of Black Steel. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.